Sometimes, the quietest bonds are the ones that save us. There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels sacred. In this story, an old war veteran, a wounded dog, and a forgotten boy find each other in the most unexpected way, and what unfolds is not just survival, but healing. Welcome to Vale Marks, where we tell stories that don't just entertain, they touch the soul. This video carries a deep and emotional lesson, so stay with us until the end. And if it moves you, please subscribe and leave a comment. Your support is what fuels this channel to keep creating more stories with meaning, heart, and purpose. The wind howled outside like a wounded animal, dragging its frozen breath through the cracks in Carl Donovan's old wooden porch. Snow fell sideways, slamming against the windows like tiny fists, tapping, as if the night itself was trying to get in. Inside, Carl sat hunched over a worn armchair, wrapped in a military-issued wool blanket that had outlived 2 wars and a marriage. The heat from the old cast-iron stove barely reached his feet, but it wasn't the cold that kept him awake. It was the silence. The kind of silence that only truly settles over a man when the world has forgotten him. He took a slow sip from his chipped mug, whiskey with just enough coffee to call it that. His knuckles ached from the cold, or maybe from time. 63 winters does that to a man. Outside, the wind screamed louder, and then, suddenly, it stopped. The hush was sharp. Carl froze. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the wind. It was soft, deliberate. A scratching. No, not a scratch. A scrape. A slow, steady drag against wood. 3 claws, maybe 4, right at his front door. He set the mug down without a sound. His heart, which usually beat like a slow drum, quickened. Not out of fear. He hadn't feared anything in decades. But out of something older. Instinct. The kind that makes a man listen before he moves. Another scrape. A pause. A low, almost inaudible huff of breath. Carl stood, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. He walked toward the door, not bothering with the light switch. He hadn't replaced the bulb in months. His hand hovered over the knob. He waited. No more sounds. Just silence. He opened the door, and there it was. A Pitbull. Big. Stocky. Fur soaked with melting snow, chest heaving slowly. Its coat was a mix of muddy gray and ghost white, like storm clouds over desert sand. But what struck Carl wasn't its size or the sheer presence of the beast standing on his porch in a snowstorm. It was the eyes. Brown. Deep brown. Familiar. Too familiar. They stared straight into him, calm, unflinching, not a flicker of aggression. No barking, no growling, not even a whimper. Just stillness, like a soldier waiting for orders, like someone who had already seen too much to be afraid. Carl swallowed hard. He hated pit bulls, always had, not because of the headlines or the stories people told, but because of one pit bull, a lifetime ago. He looked around. No leash, no tags, no tracks leading up to the porch, as if the dog had emerged from the storm itself. Then he noticed something else. On the dog's back, draped over one shoulder like a shawl, was a piece of old cloth. Torn, frayed, the edges stiff from snow. Carl leaned forward slightly. There, barely visible under the mud and time, was a stitched letter. A C. His throat tightened. For a moment, the cold wasn't outside anymore. It was inside him, a freezing claw curling around his lungs. The dog didn't move. Didn't flinch. Carl stepped back and shut the door. He didn't lock it. He returned to his chair, poured himself another splash of whiskey. He didn't drink it. He just stared at the door. Outside, the wind returned, louder now, but he didn't hear it. He was hearing something else. Laughter, gunfire, the low rumble of a military jeep crawling over desert sand. He saw faces he hadn't seen in years. Ray Mason's grin. The dog beside him, sitting straight in the back of the truck. That same stare. Bronx. Number it couldn't be. That was over 20 years ago. Bronx had been Ray's dog, trained to guard supply convoys, sniff out explosives, and stay cool under pressure. Carl had never liked him. Too alert. Too still. Like he was always calculating something. But Bronx had saved Carl's life more than once. Once in Fallujah, when a mortar shell buried Carl under rubble and Bronx stayed by him for 3 hours until help came. And again during the ambush on Route Indigo, when Bronx lunged at a man holding a grenade. Carl had seen things in that dog that defied logic, but he was just a dog. And he had died. Hadn't he? Carl stared at the door again. The image of that stitched C burned in his mind. Who would do that? He walked back, opened the door once more. The dog was gone. But on the porch, right where the animal had been sitting, was the piece of cloth, folded almost neatly, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. The snow hadn't even touched it. He picked it up. It was soft, despite the years. He turned it over. Not just the letter C, but a second smaller line of stitching beneath it, barely visible. Don't forget. Carl stood motionless for a long time, the cloth trembling slightly in his hand. The wind blew harder now, slapping at his coat, begging him to come back inside. But he didn't. Not yet. Because something in those eyes, something about the way that dog had just waited. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinct. It was purpose. Carl turned and looked out into the snow. The Pitbull had disappeared into the dark. But Carl knew, with a certainty that made his bones ache, that he hadn't seen the last of it. Not by a long shot. That night, Carl left the porch light on for the first time in years. He set the cloth on the table by his bed. He didn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars, the anger, the silence, something had stirred, and for the first time in 2 decades, Carl was listening again. The morning after the storm, Carl didn't open the door right away. The cloth sat on his kitchen table, half dried now, its edges curled like leaves in autumn. The stitched letter C still stared at him, stubborn and silent. He had stared at it most of the night, his hands trembling slightly when he reached out to touch it. Something about the way it was folded, the way it had been left, not dropped, but placed, unsettled him in a way that nothing had for years. He hadn't thought about Ray Mason in a long time. Didn't want to. Ray had been more than just a friend. Back then, in the thick of it, he was Carl's brother in everything but blood. They had shared foxholes, cigarette packs, whispered stories about home, and stupid jokes that made no sense in daylight. Ray was the kind of man who could make hell seem manageable, always smiling, always loud, always reckless in the way only someone who believed he'd never die could be. And Bronx? Bronx had been Ray's shadow. That dog was unlike any Carl had seen. Muscular, calm, razor-focused. Bronx had been trained to guard their supply runs, sometimes through quiet villages, sometimes through roads littered with broken glass and tension so thick it choked the air. He was never just a dog. He was something else. Something with a presence. Like he knew things. It had taken Carl a long time to trust him. Maybe he never fully did. He remembered the first time he saw Bronx, stepping off the back of a truck, eyes scanning the camp like he already owned the place. Soldiers had joked that Bronx outranked them. Ray had treated him like a partner, not a pet. Fed him first, slept next to him. Told Carl once, "If you ever get hit, pray Bronx finds you before anyone else." He did. Carl ran a hand through his graying beard, then stood and shuffled to the living room window. The snow had stopped. The road was a blur of white. No paw prints, no signs of anything. Just silence. His eyes drifted again to the cloth on the table. Don't forget. It wasn't just the stitching. It was a command, a memory. And like floodgates opening, the past came rushing in, one moment in particular. It had been a routine transport mission, or as routine as anything could be in that place. They were 3 trucks deep, loaded with supplies headed to a forward base. Carl was riding shotgun in the second truck. Ray was driving. Bronx was in the back, eyes never blinking, ears up. Then everything exploded. Carl never saw the IED. Just a flash of heat, then smoke, then screaming. He was thrown into a ditch, dazed, ribs cracked, leg bleeding. The world spun. He remembered yelling Ray's name. He remembered Bronx barking. But Ray never answered. When Carl came to, all he saw was the 3rd truck burning. The first was gone. The second was flipped on its side, and Bronx, somehow, was there beside him, limping, head low, nudging Carl with his snout. Bronx stayed with him for hours, didn't move, didn't bark, just sat there guarding him until help came. Ray had driven off. He later claimed he thought Carl had been in the other truck, claimed he was circling back for them when the command pulled him to return. Carl never believed it. Not after seeing the look in Ray's eyes the next time they crossed paths. 1 part guilt, 2 parts denial. Carl finished the tour, but something inside him never made it home. He stopped returning phone calls, stopped showing up at reunions, stopped speaking about Ray or Bronx or any of it. Because for Carl, trust had died in that ditch, and not just trust in people, trust in loyalty, in brotherhood, even in the bond between man and animal. Bronx, he assumed, had died. Maybe in that fire, maybe after. He never asked. He didn't want to know. So when those brown eyes stared at him last night from the porch, quiet, steady, full of something more human than animal, Carl had felt like the universe had made a crack in time just wide enough for a ghost to slip through. He sat back down, the wood of the kitchen chair cold against his back, picked up the cloth again. What were the odds? Bronx couldn't have survived. Could he? Carl rubbed the cloth between his fingers. The stitching was old, faded, but neat, precise. Ray's sister used to sew initials into their uniforms when they were kids before they enlisted. "So you boys don't forget who you are," she'd say, smiling. Was this hers? Was this from back then? And if it was, how had it survived? How had Bronx survived? Carl didn't believe in signs. He believed in silence, in discipline, in consequences. But this couldn't be coincidence. Something had returned. Something that wasn't supposed to. He stood again, this time walking over to the old trunk at the end of his hallway. It hadn't been opened in years. Dust clung to its hinges. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan. Inside, folded beneath his medals and a faded flag, was a photograph. 3 figures. One man with a crooked smile, Ray. One younger, leaner version of himself, standing with arms crossed. And between them, sitting proud and alert, tongue out just a little, Bronx. Carl stared at it. The eyes in that photo were the same ones he had seen last night. Tired, steady, patient. He thought he'd buried that chapter of his life, that the past couldn't knock on his door anymore, but now it was scratching, again. And Carl was starting to realize that some ghosts don't come back to haunt you. They come back to ask for help. The next night, Carl waited. Not consciously, of course. He didn't sit by the window or stand at the door like some eager child. That wasn't him. That had never been him. But something in the way he moved, how he turned off the TV earlier than usual, how he didn't refill his whiskey glass, how he opened the curtain just a sliver wider, suggested otherwise. The storm had passed. The snow outside had softened into a quiet white sheet, untouched and glowing faintly under the porch light he'd left on. Again. Not because he expected anything, but because somehow he did. And then, just after midnight, it happened. That same slow scrape at the door. Not frantic, not demanding, just present, like a knock without the knock. Carl stood. No hesitation this time. He opened the door. Bronx was there, same as before, still as stone soaked from the frost melting off nearby trees. But tonight, something was different. Draped over the dog's back was a strip of cloth. Frayed, damp, familiar. Carl bent slowly and picked it up. A piece of flannel, blue and gray like an old shirt pattern. Tied around it was a crust of bread, nearly stale. And beneath that, a small wad of fabric, a torn piece of what might have once been a winter glove. Bronx didn't move, didn't even blink. Carl opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. What was he going to say? "Why are you bringing me scraps? Where are you taking these from?" He wasn't even sure he believed this was Bronx. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. But then again, maybe he didn't need to be sure. The next night, it happened again. And again the night after that. And the one after that. Always around midnight. Always the same. Bronx would appear at the door, leave behind a bundle of something, food, cloth, objects barely worth a dime, and then vanish into the dark before dawn. He never tried to come in, never whimpered or scratched for shelter. He just delivered, like a message. At first, Carl thought the dog might be scavenging, trying to survive, dragging things from trash heaps or broken homes. But over time, he realized Bronx wasn't desperate. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't begging. He was communicating. Each bundle was deliberate, chosen. Each item folded, placed, never dropped. Each glance back before he walked off. It was like Bronx was reporting, like he had a mission. Carl didn't know what he was supposed to do with this, but something inside him shifted, almost reluctantly. It had been years since anything had pulled at his attention, his time, his curiosity, but Bronx, this dog who wasn't supposed to exist, was undoing his silence, piece by piece. One night, after the 5th visit, Carl sat at the old writing desk near the window. He hadn't used it in decades. Dust had claimed most of it. But the drawer still opened with a creak, and inside was a small leather notebook, yellowed with age, corners fraying. He opened it. The first pages were lists, inventory from his military years, handwritten supply logs, half-finished maps. Then deeper in, memories. He hadn't even remembered writing some of it. Short lines, like battlefield haiku. Ray said the coffee tastes like gunpowder. Bronx barked once, saved 5 men. Dust burns more than fire. Near the back, something folded. Carl took it out with stiff hands. It was a photo. 3 people. Well, 2 men and a dog. Him, younger. Ray, grinning like an idiot. And Bronx, proud, straight-backed, almost majestic in his stance. Carl stared at it for a long time. And then, for reasons he couldn't explain, he tore it down the middle. Ray's half fluttered to the ground. The half with Bronx and himself trembled in his fingers. He breathed in through his nose, jaw tight, eyes dry. And then, just as quietly, he reached down, picked up the torn half with Ray, and carefully, almost reverently, pressed the 2 pieces back together. He opened the back of his notebook and slid the full photo inside. He closed the cover gently, like tucking in a child. He didn't say it out loud, but the truth sat there, unspoken. He wasn't angry anymore, not really. And if he wasn't letting it win. Bronx had come back with a message, not of revenge, not of bitterness, but of duty, of purpose. And something in Carl, long buried under frost and silence, was starting to thaw. Maybe it was the way the dog never asked for anything. Maybe it was the nightly ritual, the consistency, the trust that seemed to bloom without words. Or maybe it was the way Bronx reminded him, not just of who he used to be, but of who he could still be, even now. One night, Carl left a piece of cooked chicken on the porch step, just to see. Bronx took it, didn't run, didn't flinch, just accepted the offering with quiet dignity. Carl stood in the doorway as Bronx turned and walked down the steps. Halfway across the yard, the dog paused, looked back. Just once. And in that glance, Carl saw something. Not thanks, not recognition, but expectation. Like Bronx was saying, "Come on, You know there's more. That night, Carl sat on the porch with the old flannel blanket draped over his legs, the snow crunching softly in the distance. He looked out into the dark, not with dread, but with a quiet knowing. Bronx would return, and when he did, Carl would be ready, not just to open the door, but to follow. Carl wasn't sure what pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was the way Bronx had looked back at him that last time, pausing in the snow like a sentinel waiting for his commander to move. Or maybe it was the bundle he had left the night before, this time with a half-burned matchstick tucked inside the cloth. A warning? A location? Carl couldn't ignore it anymore. Bronx wasn't just appearing randomly, he was guiding him. And tonight, Carl finally chose to follow. He layered up quietly, pulling on his old combat boots, heavy coat, and a flashlight that hadn't seen use since a blackout 4 winters ago. As he stepped onto the porch, Bronx was already there, waiting. Not lying down, not pacing, just standing, watching. Carl didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Bronx turned and trotted off the porch into the cold night, his movements silent and precise like muscle memory from a life that never really left him. Carl followed. The streets were mostly empty, long abandoned after the factories had shut down and the mills stopped spinning. Rusted-out cars sat on cinder blocks like broken toys. Street lamps flickered, or didn't work at all. It was the kind of part of town where no one asked questions anymore, just silence and shadows. Bronx moved like he knew every crack in the pavement, every shortcut through forgotten alleyways. He didn't check to see if Carl was behind him. He simply trusted he would be. After nearly 20 minutes of weaving through side streets and empty lots, they arrived at the west end of town. An old shipping warehouse loomed ahead, its metal siding dented, windows either broken or boarded up. The chain-link fence surrounding it had been cut, sloppily but wide enough for a grown man to slip through. Bronx pushed through the gap and waited. Carl followed, his breath visible in the cold, his heart starting to pound. Inside, the warehouse was darker than night. The roof had caved in on one side, letting in patches of moonlight that spilled like ghostly footprints across the floor. Old pallets, broken crates, and forgotten office furniture were scattered like debris from a storm. Bronx led him to the far end of the building, toward a small metal door tucked behind a stack of crates. He stopped in front of it, then sat down. Carl approached cautiously. The door had a padlock, but it hung loosely, unlatched. When he opened it, the creak echoed like thunder in the silence. The room inside was small, cold, and smelled like damp cement and rust. In the corner, curled up beneath a blanket of tattered cloth and scraps, was a boy. He looked about 10, thin, pale with matted hair and cheeks streaked with grime. He didn't scream, didn't move, just blinked slowly, as if unsure if what he was seeing was real. Carl crouched beside him. "Hey there," he said gently, voice hoarse from disuse. "It's okay. You're safe now." The boy didn't answer. His lips were dry. His breath was shallow. Bronx stepped inside the room and lay beside the boy, resting his head near the child's feet. The dog's eyes never left the boy, not once. Carl noticed crumbs on the floor, an old cloth tied around the boy's shoulders like a scarf, bits of the same material Bronx had been leaving at Carl's doorstep. Bronx had been feeding him, warming him, protecting him, alone. "How long's he been here?" Carl whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The boy blinked again, and then, so faint it was barely audible, he said, "He comes every night." Carl's breath caught. The boy looked up at him. His eyes were a soft hazel, but there was something in the shape of his face, the set of his jaw, the narrow chin, a familiarity that hit Carl like a wave. "What's your name, son?" Carl asked quietly. "Tyler," the boy answered, voice small. Carl swallowed hard. That name, that face, it couldn't be. But it was. Ray's nephew, maybe even his son. The resemblance was unmistakable. Carl sat back, stunned. This was why Bronx had come, not to seek refuge, not for food or shelter, but to save him. A child caught in something he never asked to be part of, a child who carried the blood of a man Carl had never forgiven. And yet, Bronx had never hesitated. No grudge, no bitterness, just loyalty, not to Ray, but to what was right. Carl gently wrapped his coat around Tyler and pulled out his phone to call for help. As the boy leaned weakly into his side, Carl looked down at Bronx. The dog didn't look back. He didn't need to. Carl understood now. Bronx hadn't returned for Carl. He'd returned because he knew Carl would do the right thing. Because once, long ago, they had been soldiers on the same side. And now they were again. Carl hadn't spoken Ray Mason's name out loud in over 20 years. Even hearing it now, rolling around in his thoughts like a stone in a boot, made his jaw clench. After the night he found Tyler, Carl knew the silence was over. He couldn't pretend anymore that the past had stayed buried. The truth was clawing its way back, and it had a name. Ray, his old friend, his old wound. He started digging the next day, slowly, methodically. In a town this small, you didn't need a private investigator, just a few phone calls, a few well-placed questions at the diner, and a whole lot of coffee refills. Ray had returned to town nearly 5 years ago, buying up a row of old warehouses near the docks. To the public, he was a success story, a veteran who came home, kept his head down, and built something from nothing. Smart with logistics, people said. Doesn't talk much but pays on time. Carl wasn't buying it. He drove past one of Ray's buildings that afternoon. It looked normal enough, new paint, decent fencing, an office trailer out front. But Carl knew what hidden operations looked like. He knew how to spot warehouses with too few cameras but too many guards. The kind that didn't advertise but never stayed empty. He saw tire marks from trucks that didn't match any of the local delivery schedules. He saw men standing around, not doing much, but always watching. And then there was the gate, or rather, what was behind it. A dog run, empty now, but the fencing still had claw marks. Deep ones, the kind that only came from something desperate to escape. Carl didn't need more proof. He drove back home, heart pounding with a mix of rage and clarity. Bronx had been brought back into Ray's world, not as a hero, not as family, but as a tool, a piece of muscle forced again into servitude, used to guard illegal shipments in silence. Carl could only imagine how Ray had justified it, probably told himself the dog needed a job, or that he was trained for this. But Carl knew better. Ray hadn't changed. He had just learned to hide better. Carl sat on his porch that night, the air cold, the stars dull and far away. Bronx lay beside him, his eyes closed but ears twitching at every passing sound. Tyler was asleep inside, his breathing finally calm after the chaos of the last 2 days. Carl looked down at Bronx and whispered, "How long were you stuck there?" Bronx didn't move. He didn't need to answer. Carl already knew. Long enough to remember, long enough to plan, long enough to escape. Tyler had told Carl what little he could in his hoarse, tired voice. He hadn't meant to stumble onto Ray's secret. One day he was just helping around the warehouse, sweeping floors, organizing boxes. Then he'd opened the wrong door, saw the wrong set of crates, overheard the wrong conversation. He hadn't even known what it meant, not really. But Ray had. And that was all that mattered. He locked the boy away without hesitation. Didn't call the police, didn't tell family. Just disappeared him like a problem to be dealt with later. Carl stared into the dark and felt something hot build behind his ribs. Not just anger, but shame. He had once called that man his brother. He had laughed with him, trusted him, followed him into fire, and Ray had walked out of it without a second glance. Bronx, though. Bronx had remembered everything. Had endured the abuse, The confinement, the orders barked by the same man who'd once abandoned them both. But he hadn't stayed silent. He hadn't turned bitter. He'd found a way out. And somehow, through the snow, the streets, the scars, he had found Carl. Because Bronx still believed in him. That realization hit harder than Carl expected. It made his eyes burn, made his throat tighten. Bronx hadn't returned because he needed help. He'd returned because he knew Carl needed to help. They were both relics. Leftovers from a time people didn't talk about anymore. A man and a dog too old to be useful, too scarred to be embraced. But here they were, together again. Not to relive the past, but to do what was right now. Carl reached out and placed a rough hand on Bronx's head. The dog didn't flinch, didn't stir, but he let out a breath, long and slow, as if to say, finally. The next morning, Carl made a decision. He called the sheriff. He gave him the location of the warehouse, what Tyler had said, what he suspected. He didn't mention Ray by name, not yet, but he planted the seeds. Then he sat down and started writing, not in the old military ledger, in a new notebook. Clean pages, no maps, no codes, just thoughts, stories. One of the first entries was a single sentence. Some ghosts come back not to haunt you, but to ask, "Are you still the man you once were?" Carl didn't know the answer yet, but with Bronx beside him and Tyler safe upstairs, he was willing to try. Carl had known this moment was coming. After the sheriff's quiet investigation began, after Tyler was taken in for a medical check, after Bronx finally slept a full night under Carl's roof, it was only a matter of time before Ray Mason came knocking. Carl just hadn't expected him to show up like this. It was early evening. The sun had barely dipped below the tree line, casting long golden fingers across the porch. Carl had just poured himself a cup of black coffee when he heard the heavy crunch of tires over gravel. He looked up and saw the truck. Same old model Ray used to drive. Beat-up Ford, navy blue, still with that dent in the front fender from a bar fight back in '03. It rumbled to a stop just shy of the front steps, engine cutting off with a guttural sigh. Carl didn't move. Bronx, lying near the screen door, lifted his head. He knew. The truck door creaked open. Out stepped Ray. He looked older, not in the way time naturally ages a man, but harder, darker. His once boyish charm was gone, replaced by a bitterness that clung to his features like a second skin. He walked with the casual arrogance of someone who believed he still had power, a man who had gotten away with too much for too long. "You got something of mine?" Ray called out, voice like gravel and smoke. Carl didn't answer. He took a sip of his coffee, steady, calm. Ray stepped onto the first porch stair. That's when Bronx stood. The Pitbull positioned himself between Carl and the steps, stiff-legged and low, body tense. His side still showed signs of healing, stitches from the escape, faint scars under the fur, but there was no fear in him. Ray snorted. "Seriously? You're hiding behind that dog now?" Bronx growled low, not loud, not theatrical, just enough to chill the air. Carl finally spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Ray." Ray's eyes flicked between the dog and the man behind it. "You took Tyler. That was a mistake." "I didn't take him," Carl said. "You locked him in a warehouse." Ray's face twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about." Carl stood now, set the mug down on the rail. His voice, when it came again, was calm, measured. "You left us to die, me and Bronx, back in that convoy, remember?" Ray's jaw tensed, but he didn't reply. Carl took a step forward, still behind Bronx. "You abandoned your team. Then you came back here and did it all over again. Used the dog you left behind, hurt your own family. For what? Money? Power?" Ray's lip curled. "Don't pretend you're some righteous hero, Carl. You disappeared. You gave up. I built something." Carl's eyes narrowed. "You built nothing but a wall to hide behind." Ray's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Move! I'm taking the boy. He's mine." Carl shook his head slowly. You left him just like you left Bronx. You don't get to come back and claim what you broke. Ray's mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. I thought you died with all those ghosts in the desert, Carl. Carl met his eyes, voice steady. I did die, until Bronx came back. That was it. Ray reached into his coat and pulled something out, a short blade glinting in the dying light. Carl didn't flinch, but Bronx moved, fast. He launched forward in a blur of muscle and fury, teeth bared. The blade flashed, slicing shallow across Bronx's side, but the dog didn't stop. He collided with Ray, knocking him backward off the porch, jaws clamping down on Ray's arm. Ray howled, stumbling, trying to fight him off, but Bronx was relentless, driven not by rage, but duty. Carl jumped down the steps, shouting, Bronx, down! The dog obeyed. He released and backed off, still standing between Ray and Carl, chest heaving, blood staining his side. Ray staggered to his knees, holding his injured arm, gasping. That's when the sirens pierced the quiet. 2 sheriff cruisers roared up the driveway, lights flashing. Deputies leapt out, weapons drawn. Carl raised his hands. It's over. He's armed. He came to take the boy. Ray froze. Then, with a final growl of frustration, he dropped the knife and fell back against the dirt, chest rising and falling in exhausted defeat. The officers cuffed him without a word. Carl turned to Bronx. The dog stood still, eyes locked on Carl's face. His legs trembled. Then slowly he lowered himself to the ground and collapsed near Carl's boots. Carl dropped to his knees, pressing a hand to the wound. You're okay, he whispered. You're okay, boy. Bronx looked up at him, tired, but not broken. His eyes, still burning with that same fire Carl remembered from years ago, seemed to say, mission accomplished. Carl sat there beside him as the lights from the squad cars painted streaks across the front yard. Officers moved around them, taking statements, securing Ray. But in that moment, all Carl could see was Bronx, wounded, loyal, unshaken. Carl reached out, resting his hand gently on the dog's head. You didn't let me down, not once. Bronx didn't move, just closed his eyes. And for the first time in decades, Carl felt something return. Not just a sense of justice, but of honor, of connection, of being part of something worth protecting again. The battle was over. But the bond between a man and the dog who came back had never been stronger. The trial didn't take long. Ray's crimes weren't just whispered rumors anymore. They were documented, photographed, and backed up by evidence from the warehouse, from Tyler's testimony, and even from Bronx, whose injuries spoke louder than words. Ray was charged, denied bail, and taken away. Just like that, the shadow that had loomed over Carl's life for decades was finally gone. But it wasn't victory that Carl felt. It was quiet. Not the silence of emptiness he had lived with for years, but something softer. A stillness that allowed him to exhale, to exist, without the armor he'd worn since the desert. He was no longer waiting for something to explode, for someone to vanish. For the first time in a long time, Carl Donovan was simply living. Tyler moved in 2 weeks later. The paperwork wasn't hard. Carl was a war veteran with no criminal history and a quiet, stable life. Tyler had no other family willing to take him. The state didn't put up a fight, but it wasn't the documents that made them a family. It was the mornings. The way Tyler would shuffle into the kitchen, still half asleep, rubbing his eyes and searching for Carl's mug like it was a compass needle pointing to safety. It was the way he asked questions, slowly, cautiously, about the stars, about war, about why people leave and whether they come back. It was the way he would fall asleep on the couch during movies, head resting on Bronx's side, fingers curled into the dog's fur like it was the last rope holding him steady. And Bronx, oh Bronx. The vets did what they could. He had a long gash down his left side, and the blade had torn through more than just muscle. One eye had gone cloudy. His gait was slower, and stairs took more effort now. But his spirit never dimmed. He still moved with purpose, still scanned the yard before laying down, still slept with one ear up and his body angled between Carl and the front door. The neighbors noticed. They'd ask Carl, "Is that the same Pitbull from the news?" Carl would nod and smile a little. "That's him." Sometimes they looked nervous, sometimes impressed, but always curious, and always Carl kept it simple. "He saved a life," he'd say. Maybe more than one. On warm days, Carl would sit on the porch while Tyler tossed a ball in the yard for Bronx. The dog didn't chase like he used to, but he'd trot after it with a gentle wag of his tail, mouth hanging open like he was smiling. Tyler didn't seem to care about how fast Bronx moved, only that he always came back. That was the thing about Bronx. He always came back. One golden afternoon, as late summer curled into early fall, Carl sat on the porch swing with his boots off and a cold glass of lemonade in hand. The air was still, the sky painted with soft pastels. Tyler was lying on the porch next to Bronx, sketching something in a spiral notebook. He wouldn't show Carl what it was yet, but Carl suspected it had to do with capes and dogs and people who never gave up. Bronx was curled up beside the boy, his chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm, one eye closed, the other still clouded but alert. Carl was drifting in thought when he heard it. "Grandpa Carl?" He turned his head, blinking as if he hadn't heard right. Tyler was looking up at him, the sketchbook resting on his lap, his voice soft. "Can I borrow the old blanket? The flannel one?" Carl didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His heart, which had endured war zones and betrayals and years of silence, felt like it had been hit square in the center. The word, Grandpa, echoed in his chest like a warm bell rung for the first time. Tyler hadn't said it with ceremony or awkwardness. He hadn't asked if it was okay. He had just said it, like it had always been true. Carl cleared his throat. "Yeah, kid, course you can." He stood and walked inside, grabbing the old flannel blanket from the arm of his recliner. The same one Bronx had once carried in from the cold, torn and weathered, now clean and folded with care. He handed it to Tyler, who wrapped it around his shoulders like a cape. "Thanks, Grandpa," the boy murmured, and returned to his drawing without another word. Carl sat back down, quiet again, but not the old kind of quiet. The good kind. He looked down at Bronx, who had lifted his head and was watching him. That one good eye, still fierce and gentle all at once, locked onto Carl's face like it was reading everything inside him. Carl reached out and laid his hand on the dog's back, fingers sinking into short fur. "I thought you needed me," he said quietly. "Turns out, I needed you more." Bronx gave a slow wag of his tail. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just a soft, steady beat against the porch floor, like a heartbeat answering his own. Carl smiled. "You stubborn old thing." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and late summer leaves. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out, and Tyler laughed softly at whatever he was drawing. Carl leaned back, his eyes half closing, letting the sunlight warm his face. This wasn't the life he thought he'd have, but it was the one he was grateful for. A wounded dog, a broken soldier, a forgotten boy. 3 souls, pieced together by circumstance, held together by loyalty. It didn't matter how it started. It mattered that they were here, together. And as the sun dipped lower, painting the yard in gold, Carl whispered something that only Bronx and the wind would hear. "We're home now. We don't choose who saves us. Sometimes it's the ones we least expect." Thank you for staying through this journey with Veil Marks. Carl, Bronx, and Tyler didn't start as a family, but they became one. Not by blood, but by courage, loyalty, and love that doesn't ask for anything in return. As the old saying goes, some scars are not wounds, but proof that we survived. If this story touched you, Let us know in the comments, and please consider subscribing. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can continue creating emotional, high-quality stories like this. Every view, every comment, every sub is a quiet reminder that storytelling still matters, that you still believe in it. Thank you for being here.